September 14, 1943. Somewhere in the forests of occupied Yugoslavia, the night was holding its breath. No wind, no crickets, only the distant mechanical groan of a locomotive pushing its weight up a mountain grade, and one man, belly flat in the cold mud, watching it come. His name was Branko Vukovic. He was 41 years old. He had never been a soldier. He had never fired a rifle in anger. He had never studied engineering or chemistry or the science of demolition. He was a farmer. And in approximately 4 minutes, the most important German supply train on the Sarajevo to Belgrade line, carrying fuel, artillery shells, and winter equipment for an entire Wehrmacht division, was going to cease to exist. The SS had been hunting the man they called Vegetar, Wind, for 6 months. They had burned 3 villages. They had offered rewards. They had sent their finest trackers into those forested hills. They had found nothing. Because you cannot catch what you cannot see. And Branko Vukovic had spent 41 years learning every shadow in these mountains. He pressed his cheek into the earth. He counted his heartbeats. He waited. To understand Branko Vukovic, you must first understand the land that made him. He was born in 1902 in a village called Lipovica, a cluster of stone farmhouses perched on a ridge above the Drina Harbor River in eastern Bosnia. The village had perhaps 200 souls, a single church with a cracked bell, and a market that operated, weather permitting, on the second Sunday of each month. It was the kind of place that appeared on no German military map of any strategic importance, which was, in the end, precisely why it mattered. Branko's father had been a woodcutter. His mother kept goats and made cheese that she traded in Zvornik for salt and lamp oil. Branko grew up understanding land the way other men understand language, instinctively, completely, in the marrow. He knew which hillsides held water in August, which ravines collected fog before dawn, and which forest paths stayed frozen hard enough to take a horse even in the worst February thaw. He was not a complicated man. He married a woman named Marta in 1928. They had 3 children, 2 sons and a daughter. He grew plums, kept bees, and traded lumber in the valley. He was known in the surrounding villages as a man of few words and extraordinary patience. A neighbor once told a story of how Branko had sat still in a pine tree for 7 hours waiting for a marten that had been killing his chickens. When it finally appeared, he took it with a single stone from a sling, a weapon he had used since boyhood. Patience, precision, economy of movement. These were the things the land had taught him. No one, in April of 1941, would have predicted they would also make him one of the most effective saboteurs in occupied Yugoslavia. The Germans arrived in Bosnia in the spring of 1941 as part of the Axis invasion that dismembered Yugoslavia in 11 days. For the villagers of Lipovica, the occupation began as a distant rumor, boots on distant roads, columns of gray vehicles on the valley highway below. Then it became real. German soldiers arrived in Zvornik and established a garrison. A collaborationist administration demanded grain levies. Serbian men of military age were registered and placed under curfew. Branko submitted to the registration. He handed over the required quota of grain. He was polite and quiet and said nothing that could be reported. And then, in November 1941, his eldest son Dragomir, 20 years old, studying to be a teacher in Sarajevo, was arrested in a roundup of suspected resistance sympathizers. He was taken to a transit camp outside the city. The family received 1 postcard, then nothing. Branko never spoke about what that silence did to him, but his neighbors noticed that something behind his eyes went cold and still, the way a river goes still before it drops over a falls. And they noticed over the winter that followed that Branko began spending long hours in the forest, alone, without explaining why. He told Marta he was checking his woodcutting stores. He was not checking his woodcutting stores. He was studying the railway line. The Sarajevo to Belgrade rail corridor ran along the valley floor 5 kilometers below Lipovica. It was one of the most critical arteries in the German occupation of the Balkans, carrying troops, fuel, ammunition, and supplies north toward the Hungarian border and east toward Greece. German engineers had fortified the most obvious vulnerable points, the major bridges, the tunnel entrances, the switching stations. They had guard posted regular intervals and rail-mounted patrols that swept the line twice each night. But 5 kilometers of track cannot be watched from every angle, at every hour, by every pair of eyes. Branko began to understand this in January of 1942. By March, he had identified 3 points where the line was briefly invisible to the patrol schedule. By May, he had worked out what a man would need to do serious damage. The problem was the materials. He had no explosives, he had no detonators, he had no training. He had a farm, and he had, as it turned out, a great deal of patience. The first thing Branco made was not a bomb, it was a mistake. In the summer of 1942, he had gathered enough saltpeter, leached from the soil beneath his compost pile over a period of months, to attempt a rudimentary black powder mixture. He worked in a hollow 3 kilometers from the village, beneath a limestone overhang that kept the rain off. He had no technical knowledge beyond what he could reason through from first principles, and what he had heard from an old man in the next valley who had once worked in a quarry. The first batch went wrong almost immediately. The proportions were off. When he tested a small amount against a piece of deadfall pine, it produced more smoke than force, a thick, acrid cloud that hung in the hollow for 20 minutes, and which he was convinced could be seen from the valley road. He scattered the mixture, buried the residue, and walked home through a circuitous route, arriving in time to milk the goats as if nothing had happened. He spent 3 weeks rethinking the proportions. The second batch was better, not good, not what he needed, but better. He was learning that chemistry was, at its core, simply a more precise form of farming. You understood what your inputs were. You understood what your soil or your mixture would do with them. You adjusted. You waited. You tried again. But Branco was also realistic. He understood that homemade black powder, even in quantity, was unlikely to destroy a locomotive or collapse a section of heavy rail. He would need something more. And so he began to think, not about destroying the lime itself, but about what happened when a train derailed at speed on a mountain grade. The answer was a great deal. In October 1942, he made contact, cautiously, through a chain of intermediaries that involved a schoolteacher in Zvornik and a former gendarme in Kladanj, with a small partisan cell operating in the mountains to the north. The cell had 4 members, none of them with demolitions experience, but one of them, a woman named Gordana, who had been an industrial chemist before the war, knew enough to help Branco refine his process. She came to Libovice twice. She never stayed more than 1 night. She brought nothing that could be found on her person that would mean her death, only knowledge carried in her head. She corrected his saltpeter processing. She explained the principles of a percussion fuse, using materials that could be obtained from a farm supply depot. She told him what he actually needed was not a large explosion. He needed a precise one, placed in the right location on the rail at the right moment. Branco listened to everything she said. He asked no questions while she spoke. When she was done, he repeated back to her, point by point, everything she had told him. Perfectly, verbatim. Gordana later told the cell's commander that talking to Branko Vukovic was like talking to a stone wall, and then watching the wall remember every word. The first operation was modest. It was not a train. In December 1942, a German supply convoy used the mountain road above Lipovice to bypass a washed-out section of the Valley Highway. The convoy consisted of 6 trucks carrying engine fuel in metal drums, destined for a Luftwaffe auxiliary field outside Sarajevo. Branco knew about the convoy 3 days before it arrived. His network of informants in the valley was built entirely on trust, on shared grievance, on decades of relationships that predated the occupation by a generation. He did not use explosives. He used the road. The mountain track above Lipovice had a switchback, a tight hairpin curve above a 40-meter drop that the German drivers would navigate slowly, in low gear. 2 nights before the convoy, Branco spent 4 hours in the dark with a hand at Z and a pry bar, carefully undermining the outer edge of the track surface. He did not remove material. He loosened it. He packed the gaps with frozen soil that would look solid in daylight and feel solid under the first few vehicles, but which would give way under the sustained weight of a fully loaded truck. He returned home before dawn. He milked the goats at first light. When the convoy reached the hairpin, the lead truck passed without incident. The second truck passed. The third truck, the heaviest, carrying a double load of fuel drums, broke through the outer edge and slid sideways off the track. It did not fall cleanly. It lodged against a pine tree on the slope, tipping at a severe angle, the drum shifting and crashing inside the canvas cover. No one died. Branco had not intended anyone to die. He had intended to stop the convoy and delay the fuel delivery by at least 24 hours, which he calculated would ground the Luftwaffe aircraft at the auxiliary field during a window when, according to his informants, partisan forces planned a movement across the open plateau to the east. Whether his calculation contributed directly to partisan survival that day, he never knew. He never sought to find out. He was not interested in the strategic picture. He was interested in the specific, achievable thing in front of him. The Germans investigated the incident. They found no evidence of tampering. The damage looked like road subsidence, which was common in that terrain in winter. An officer filed a report citing poor road maintenance by the local administration. The local administration filed a counter-report blaming German vehicles that were too heavy for mountain tracks. Nobody looked at the farmer in Lipovica who kept bees and grew plums. Over the following 8 months, Branko carried out 6 more operations, each one slightly more ambitious than the last. He derailed a light rail cart, an unmanned supply car, by placing a wedge of hardwood under the rail joint at the precise point where the track curved and the speed naturally increased. The cart jumped the rail and tipped, spilling its cargo of machine parts into the riverbed below. He redirected a German patrol's search dogs by laying any soil across a false trail that led the animals 2 kilometers up a dead-end ravine. He fed deliberately incorrect information about partisan positions to a known collaborator in Zolfanik. Information plausible enough to be believed, specific enough to divert 2 companies of German infantry on a 3-day march through empty forest. He never fired a weapon. He never needed to. By the summer of 1943, German security reports for the sector noted a pattern of low-level disruption that could not be attributed to any known partisan unit. The disruptions were too varied in method, too precisely timed, and too localized to a specific stretch of the Drina Valley to be random. One report, filed by an Abwehr officer named Hauptmann Werner Kiefer, contained a note that would be found after the war in a captured filing cabinet in Sarajevo. It read, "The source of these incidents is almost certainly a single individual with exceptional local knowledge. He does not use standard partisan methods. He is patient. He is careful. He does not repeat himself. He is, whoever he is, very dangerous." Kiefer circulated the report to the regional command. He requested additional investigative resources. He was told that the situation did not meet the threshold for full SS involvement. He would revise that assessment in September. The train was called Versorgung zur Datie 78 in German logistics records. It ran the Sarajevo to Belgrade corridor every 10 to 12 days, and its cargo on the run of September 14, 1943 was, by any military calculus, extraordinary. 22 wagons, 1,800 drums of vehicle and aviation fuel, 40 crates of 88 mm artillery shells, winter equipment for a full infantry division, coats, boots, blankets, medical supplies, badly needed as the Wehrmacht prepared for what German commanders privately understood was going to be a brutal winter campaign in the Balkans. Destroying Versorgungszug 7 would not win the war. Branko Vukovic had no illusions about that, but it would delay the fuel supply for the Sarajevo garrison by at least a month. It would destroy irreplaceable ammunition stocks at a moment when German resupply lines through Hungary were already strained, and it would demonstrate to the German command and to every village and hamlet in that valley that the mountains themselves were hostile. He had been planning it since June. The location was a stretch of track he had identified in his very first winter of reconnaissance. A section where the line curved sharply around the base of a limestone bluff, reducing train speed to approximately 20 kilometers per hour before dropping into a descent toward the river crossing. At the apex of that curve, the outer rail took the full lateral force of the train's momentum. If the joint between 2 sections of outer rail could be compromised precisely, not merely loosened but fractured at the point of maximum stress, the wheels of a heavy locomotive would push outward against the weakened joint at exactly the wrong moment. The locomotive would leave the track at a curve, on a descent, with 1,800 drums of fuel behind it. The physics were, as Branko understood them, straightforward. The execution was not. He had 3 problems. The first was the rail itself. Wehrmacht engineers had replaced the pre-war Yugoslavian rail with heavier German standard stock after the occupation. The joints were bolted with larger fasteners and the base plates were spiked deeper. Undermining the joint enough to cause a failure at low speed required not just loosening the bolts but compromising the web of the rail itself. He needed a shaped charge, not a displacement device. The second problem was the patrol schedule. By September 1943, German rail security in the sector had been tightened in response to partisan activity further north. A motorized rail trolley, armed, carrying 4 soldiers, swept the line in each direction twice per night on a schedule that varied by approximately 15 minutes in either direction to prevent pattern exploitation. The window in which a man could work at the target section without encountering the trolley was, at best, 22 minutes. The third problem was that Hauptmann Kiefer had not given up. In late August, Kiefer had obtained additional resources. Not the full SS investigation he had requested, but 2 plainclothes LKDAR Matavi agents tasked with penetrating local informant networks in the Trina Valley. The agents were posing as black market traders and had been working the villages between Zvornik and the river for 3 weeks. They had not yet identified Branko, but they had identified 2 of the 7 people in his information network, including the schoolteacher in Zvornik who had been his first point of contact with the partisan cell. Branko learned about the Feldgendarmerie agents on September 8th, 6 days before the train. He did not panic. He sat in his barn for 2 hours after receiving the warning, turning the information over in his mind, the way he would turn soil, methodically, looking for what it meant and what it required. The schoolteacher had to be warned to go silent immediately. The information network had to be effectively suspended for at least 3 weeks after the operation to prevent any trail leading back through the chain. And he had to assume that the agents might have partial information about his activities, not enough to identify him, but enough to intensify scrutiny in the area after the train went down. You would have 1 shot. And after that shot, he would disappear completely for as long as it took. He sent word through a single trusted intermediary, his wife's cousin, a shepherd who moved between the high pastures and spoke to no one in any village, to the partisan cell. He did not request assistance. He requested only that Gordana sent him one thing, the percussion fuse components she had described to him almost a year earlier. The components arrived on September 11th, hidden inside a wheel of cheese carried by the shepherd. Branko spent 2 nights in the forest below the limestone bluff, doing nothing but watching. He watched the rail trolley pass. He counted the minutes between passes. He watched the stars move. He listened to the quality of silence that settled after the trolley's engine note faded toward the east. And then, 22 minutes later, the quality of silence that preceded its return from the west. 22 minutes, plus or minus 4. He needed 15. On the night of September 13th, he did a complete dry run. He moved from his concealed position in the timber to the target section of track, carrying a replica weight in his pack, the same number of kilograms as the charge he would place the following night. He moved to the dark without a lamp, navigating by memory, and by the pale strip of sky visible above the valley corridor. He reached the track. He worked in simulation at the rail joint, hands moving in darkness, by touch alone, over the shapes he had practiced on a salvaged section of similar rail in his barn over the preceding weeks. He was at the target for 11 minutes. He withdrew back into the timber with 4 minutes to spare before the trolley's headlamp appeared around the eastern curve. He lay in the dark and breathed. 11 minutes. He could do it. September 14th. The train was running 4 hours behind schedule, which Branko did not know when he left his farm at 10 in the evening. He had calculated its expected arrival at the target section for 01:15, based on its known Sarajevo departure time and the grade profile of the line. He was in position in the timber by midnight. He waited. The cold came in off the limestone bluff in waves. The temperature was perhaps 4 degrees above freezing. Cold enough to make extended stillness painful, not cold enough to be dangerous. He had worn his sheepskin coat and wrapped his hands in wool. He did not move. He breathed through his nose, slowly, letting each breath disperse before the next. 00:45. The trolley passed westbound. He noted the time by feel. He could not use a watch with a luminous dial, so he had developed a method of counting his own heartbeats in intervals, calibrated over months to an accuracy of approximately 30 seconds. 31,033. The trolley returned eastbound, normal, on schedule. He had until approximately 01:25 before the next westbound pass. He moved. The distance from his position to the track was 80 meters through mixed timber and scrub. He had walked it so many times in the preceding weeks that his body found the path without instruction, avoiding the loose shale patch at 40 meters, stepping over the exposed root at 60, ducking under the pine bough at 72. He reached the track and went to his knees. The outer rail at the joint was exactly as he had studied it. He unpacked the charge, a cylinder of his compressed black powder mixture wrapped in oilcloth, with the percussion fuse assembly threaded through the top, and placed it against the web of the outer rail at the joint, in the position he had identified as creating maximum lateral stress when loaded weight passed over the curve. He worked by touch. He did not rush. His hands were steady. The fuse mechanism Gordana had described was elegantly simple: a spring-loaded firing pin held under tension by a retaining wire. The wire was connected to a length of heavy thread which, when the train passed, would be pulled taut by the wheel flange of the locomotive, pulling the retaining wire free, releasing the firing pin, and detonating the charge at the instant of maximum stress. The mechanism had to be positioned precisely, off by 5 centimeters in either direction, and the thread would pass the wheel without catching, or catch too early before the weight was fully on the joint. He positioned it. He checked it with his fingers. He checked it with his fingers. He checked it again. 7 minutes had passed. He strung the thread across the railhead in a shallow arc, fixed the far end to a spike. He drove silently into the wooden sleeper with the padded mallet and verified the tension. Not too tight, that would trigger it prematurely. Not too loose, that would allow the wheel to pass without catching. He gathered his tools. He withdrew from the track. At the timber line, he turned back for a single look. He could see nothing at the track. The device was invisible in the darkness. He oriented himself by the bluff above and moved north along the tree line, away from his planned withdrawal route, toward a secondary position he had identified 2 weeks earlier, a hollow beneath a fallen beech, 40 meters into the forest, that provided cover from both directions of the track. He settled into the hollow. He waited. 01:31. The expected arrival time had passed. He recounted his heartbeats. 01:38, 01:38, 01:31, pin 45. He began to run contingency calculations in his mind. If the train was severely delayed more than 2 hours, there was a possibility the next patrol sweep would find the device before the train arrived. He did not know what he would do in that scenario. There was nothing he could do. He pushed the contingency aside. He waited. At 01:52, he heard it. Not the whistle. He had not expected a whistle on a wartime run through occupied territory. What he heard was the track itself, a low subsonic vibration that he felt more through the frozen ground beneath him than through his ears. The timber around him went still with it, the way animals go still before storm. Then the headlamp appeared around the eastern curve, a cone of yellow light sweeping the bluff face as the locomotive took the approach grade. The engine sound built slowly, the deep, rhythmic exhaust of a heavy locomotive at reduced speed, the clatter and clank of 22 loaded wagons behind it, the groan of steel on steel as the curve began to redirect 800 tons of moving weight. Branko pressed himself flat in the hollow. He did not close his eyes. The locomotive was at the curve. The headlamp swung. The wheel flanges began to sing against the outer rail. That high, thin frequency that told him the lateral force was building. The detonation was not loud. That surprised him, even though he had known it intellectually. His charge was small. It did not need to be large. It needed to be precise. The sound was a sharp, flat crack, like a plank of hardwood struck hard against concrete, followed by a deep metallic groan that he felt rather than heard. Then the locomotive left the track. It did not fly. It did not explode. It leaned, slowly at first, with a terrible grinding dignity, outward from the curve, the leading wheels pushing into empty air above the slope that fell away toward the river. For perhaps 2 full seconds it seemed to hover there, still moving forward under its own momentum, the headlamp now pointing at the trees across the valley. Then the weight of the boiler pulled it down. The locomotive went over sideways, still moving, tearing the first 4 wagons off the track with it in a cascade of broken coupling and shrieking steel. The fuel drums in those wagons had no chance. The first ignition was not a single explosion. It was a chain, 1 drum, then 3. Then the sound became continuous, a roaring percussion that lit the valley as if morning had arrived without warning. Branko did not watch. He was already moving north through the timber, away from the light, away from the heat, away from the sound of secondary detonations as the artillery shells in the forward wagons began to cook off one by one. He moved quickly, but he did not run. He had planned his withdrawal route with the same care he had planned everything else. The fire on the track burned for 11 hours. German emergency crews arrived within 40 minutes. They had been pre-positioned at intervals along the line precisely because partisan activity in the northern sector had made senior command nervous about exactly this kind of incident. But there was nothing they could do about the fuel. 1,800 drums of aviation and vehicle fuel, once ignited, cannot be extinguished. They burn until they are consumed. The crews focused on preventing the fire from spreading to the wooden trestle bridge 200 meters east of the derailment point. They succeeded. The bridge survived. But the track itself, the steel rail, the wooden sleepers, the ballast bed, was warped and destroyed over a section of approximately 300 meters. Wehrmacht engineers would later estimate that repairing the line to operational standard would require a minimum of 3 weeks. The Sarajevo garrison's fuel reserve, already running below comfortable levels due to supply interruptions from Hungary, fell to a level that required the grounding of all non-essential vehicle movements within 72 hours. 2 planned troop movements were delayed. One was canceled entirely. Branko knew none of this. He had reached Marta's family's summer pasture hut, empty as it always was in September, the livestock having come down from the high meadows 3 weeks earlier. By 4:30, he was 7 kilometers from Lipovice, at an altitude that put him above the fog that would form in the valley in the hours before dawn. He sat with his back against the stone wall of the hut, watching the southern sky glow orange and dim and orange again, and tried to feel something identifiable. He felt very tired. He felt, beneath the tiredness, something that was not quite relief and not quite grief and not quite satisfaction. Something without a clean name. He had done what he had intended to do. He had not been caught. No one from his network had been near the operation. The thread would not lead back. But Dragomir was still gone. He had understood before he began any of this that no act of sabotage would bring his son back. He had never confused the two things, the grief and the resistance. They lived in different rooms inside him. The resistance was not healing. It was not revenge, exactly, though revenge was part of it. It was something more basic, a refusal to let the occupation make him into something passive, a refusal to become a man who watched things happen. He had been raised by a people who had a word for this stubbornness. Inat, they called it, a Serbian term for a particular kind of defiant obstinacy that transcended practical calculation. You did the thing not because it would certainly succeed, but because to not do it was unthinkable. He stayed in the pasture hut for 8 days. Marta's cousin, the shepherd, brought him food on the 3rd day and news on the 6th. The Feld Gendarmerie had raided 2 houses in Zornik and arrested 4 men, including a grain merchant, who Branko did not know and had never dealt with. The investigation was focused on partisan connections, not on local farmers. Hauptmann Kiefer had been pulled from the sector and reassigned to a command north of Sarajevo. The official reason was a routine rotation, but the whisper in the valley was that senior command had decided his obsession with a phantom saboteur was a distraction. Branko returned to Lipovice on September 22nd. He told Marta he had been scouting timber in the high forest and had taken shelter from early snow. She did not ask questions. She had stopped asking questions in the second winter of the occupation. He resumed his farm work. He milked the goats. He harvested the last of the plums. He was, as far as any German in that valley ever knew, a farmer. Branko Vukovic carried out 4 more operations between October 1943 and March 1944. Each one was planned with the same patient, methodical precision that had characterized everything before it. None of them involved killing. All of them involved inconvenience, significant, strategically meaningful inconvenience, to an occupying force that was slowly and then rapidly losing its grip on the Balkans. When the German withdrawal began in earnest in the autumn of 1944, Branko did not celebrate in the streets of Zornik. He was not the kind of man who celebrated in streets. He went to the pasture hut in the high meadow and sat alone for one evening, watching the dark come down over the valley, listening to the silence that was, for the first time in 3 years, an actual silence, not the held breath of occupation, not the silence of people afraid to speak, just silence, the old kind. He never received official recognition during his lifetime. He never sought it. The partisan leadership, whom he had helped, sporadically and at arm's length, for 2.5 years, knew of him only by reputation and by a code name in a file. The file was lost in the administrative chaos of the post-war period. No memorial was raised. No history book mentioned his name. After the war, Branko spent 2 years searching for information about Dragomir. He found what he had, on some level, already known. His son had died in a transit camp outside Sarajevo in the winter of 1941, of typhus, 6 weeks after his arrest. He returned to Lipovica. He rebuilt the sections of his farm that had been damaged during the occupation. He grew plums. He kept bees. He grew old beside Marta, in the stone farmhouse on the ridge above the Drina. He carved furniture in his later years. Careful, intricate work, the kind that requires patience and a precise understanding of how material responds to force. Neighbors would sometimes visit and admire a chair or a cabinet and say that it was the work of a man who truly understood wood. He would agree with them and say nothing more. His daughter found his notebooks after he died in 1971. 3 composition books filled in his careful, unpracticed handwriting, describing in technical detail the operations he had conducted between 1942 and 1944. The notebooks included hand-drawn diagrams, rail joint schematics, patrol timing grids, detonation geometries. The diagrams were precise, elegant, and completely self-taught. A historian who studied the notebooks in the 1980s wrote that they were some of the most remarkable documents of individual resistance she had encountered in 2 decades of research, not because the operations were the largest or the most destructive, but because of what they revealed about their author, a man who had looked at an impossible situation and responded not with despair or with rage, but with the same methodical intelligence he had spent a lifetime applying to the problem of keeping things alive in difficult ground. She wrote, Branko Vrukovic did not think of himself as a hero. He thought of himself as a farmer who had a problem to solve. The forests above the Drina remember nothing. Forests do not keep records. The limestone bluffs above the rail line are the same bluffs they have always been, indifferent to history, patient in the way that stone is patient. But somewhere in those hills, in the grain of that silence, is the echo of a man who understood that courage is not the absence of fear. It is the presence of something that matters more than fear. And for Branko Vrukovic, that something was simple and ancient and utterly unshakable, the refusal to be made small.